Dr. Kim is an associate professor and chair of the Department of Classics and Mediterranean Studies at University of Illinois, Chicago. His academic focus is on the ancient Mediterranean world, late antiquity, and early Byzantine studies, but with a particular focus on Cyprus in late antiquity, where he has published a number of works on the earliest Cypriot church. Today, he joins us to discuss Cyprus's pivotal role in early Christianity, the First Council, and Saint Epiphanius, or Epiphanios, as we would say in modern Greek. Young, thank you for accepting my invitation and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So let's begin by exploring this concept of late antiquity, because that is obviously your focus, and I just kind of want to know what it is and what are some of the significant events that underpin the period.
It's such a good question. So we might make an argument that late antiquity, and this is with a capital L and a capital A, we might say that the study of late antiquity began in 1971. This is an argument when a most preeminent historian and scholar by the name of Peter Brown published a book that was entitled The World of Late Antiquity. And, he kind of unfolds this picture of what other scholars in the past had called the later Roman Empire, or other scholars still even called the early Middle Ages. He kind of reframed this time period as one of continuity with the ancient past of the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, but also a time of significant, sometimes rapid change. But he also sort of thought of the Mediterranean world in much bigger terms than other scholars had in the past. So late antiquity for Peter Brown included further east into the Iranian plateau, into what we would think of as the Middle East, but also places like Armenia and but also further south, including Egypt and north. I mean, in every direction. And so historians use what we call periodization. It's a way of divvying up time into kind of manageable eras, knowing that there were some significant transitions that happened at one end or the other of a particular era. And so late antiquity, again, there are lots of debates about when it starts, but one helpful starting point, let's see, for your audience might be the Emperor Constantine, right? And Constantine is famous for being the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. And so that moment in the early 4th century, that's often a point where scholars will say, okay, this is the beginning of late antiquity, because the Roman world is changing significantly with the rise of what some people call imperial Christianity, or at least Christianity becomes much more prominent. And so that could mark the beginning. Whereas the other end of the question, when does late antiquity end? That is a never-ending debate, but that's part of the fun of the work that we do. And in the case of Cyprus, which we'll talk about obviously in a second, the middle of the 7th century is often thought of as the end of late antiquity in a place like Cyprus, but we can work out those details in a second. Does that give you a sense of at least what late antiquity is as a concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, it's important to frame the period, especially for listeners to kind of, wrap their heads around what period are we talking about, what sort of events are happening. And I think the establishment of Christianity as the Roman religion really helps kind of contextualize this period. And so, under Roman rule, Cyprus, I've read in other works that it's been described as politically insignificant, but yeah. You actually argue that it played a very crucial role in trade and religion. So what is it about its geographic position that shaped this economic and cultural influence that Cyprus had in this period?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about the physical location of Cyprus, and I've actually researched and studied how the island came to exist. And so it's really interesting, the area in the Eastern Mediterranean where Cyprus is located, it's actually a meeting point of a number of different tectonic plates. And, many years ago, when this island came to exist, it was by the result of one plate pushing another plate and one going up and one going down underneath. And so in a lot of ways, it's just the forces of nature, or, whatever concept you want to say, maybe God's providence. But Cyprus just came to exist in this very ideal location in terms of its connection to and potential relationship with surrounding mainlands of Europe and Asia. And so Cyprus obviously is an island, but people have been visiting and in some cases settling in Cyprus for a very, very, very long time. And so Cyprus has, for as long as humans have been around, has been a hub, right, where people in ships are coming, people are going, and people are traveling through the island. And so when we fast forward into the Roman Empire, yeah, I mean, some scholars have described Cyprus as kind of a backwater or an unimportant place. I've even described it in some of my earlier scholarship as a kind of, like a politician's like stepping stone to you serve perhaps as an administrator there, and then you can move on to bigger and better things. But as I've learned more and more about Cyprus, especially from an archaeological perspective, Cyprus has always been this place of circulation of goods and people and ideas. And so I'm really trying to highlight that that characteristic of the island in the period that we call Late Antiquity.
Your research suggests that while much of the Roman world was in crisis in the 5th century, Cyprus thrived. And you base this on a number of key archaeological findings that support this argument. Can you share some of those findings? Because, if you've ever been to Cyprus and you've done some sightseeing, you probably witnessed, probably seen some of the very sites that you source or that you cite to support your argument.
So, one of the key features of Late Antiquity, as we talked about a little bit earlier, is this related question of when did the Roman Empire fall, right? And in earlier scholarship and narratives, the 5th century is one of these key moments, or this kind of period where things were falling apart. But this is only true, I would say, of the western part of the Roman Empire, right? And so if you look at the what we call the Rhine frontier, or even along the Danube, things are really rough in those parts of the Roman world. And closely tied to this is this long question of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Like, what were the factors? What were the causes? And there was a famous, set multi-volume book work by the English historian Edward Gibbon, right, in the 18th century, that talked about this decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And so one of the things that Peter Brown did, though, in talking about Late Antiquity, was kind of reframe this theme of decline and fall. As I mentioned, to that kind of continuity and change idea. And so one of the things that we have really agreed upon, I think, broadly speaking, is that what happened in the West is not the same as what happened in the East, right? And so Cyprus, being in the Eastern Mediterranean and that part of the world, had a very different experience of the 5th and 6th centuries compared to what was going on in places like Britannia, or what we call Gaul, which is kind of, modern day France and other countries. Cyprus in the 5th century, and this is how I talk about it in the book that I'm writing, it's the beginning of a boom time. Things are going really well for the island. It's agriculturally very productive. The Cypriots are still engaged in copper mining and processing. They're trading, they're manufacturing pottery. They're doing all these kinds of activities that some scholars have described as busy countryside. So Cyprus is really, really active. And as they're engaged in not only trade within the island, but also beyond the island to other parts of the Roman world and even beyond, that prosperity is also translating into building projects. And one of the building projects that is prominent, really beginning in the 5th century, but maybe a little bit earlier in the late 4th, is, as you mentioned, church building. And so Cypriots, they're building churches everywhere. And it's not just in the main cities, and the ones that they build in the cities are, some of them are very, very, very large and grand, like in Salamis or in Kurion or in Paphos. But they're also building churches in all of the in-between spaces, is what I call it, right? So even in river valleys and places that we would think of as rural, Cypriots are building churches. But it's like not only are they building them, they're actually decorating them with quite, in some cases, quite elaborate and expensive materials and techniques. And so really the 5th and 6th centuries, we just see Cyprus is really, really prosperous, and which is again quite a contrast to what's happening, for example, in the West, right? It's a very kind of different situation, which then tells us that late antiquity it's a very complicated periodization, because it's not all the same from one place to another.
You mentioned Gurion just now, and the House of Eustolius. I think you actually talk about that as an example of a place reflecting both continuity with the Greco-Roman past and the island's changing, growing Christian identity. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about how it's just that?
Yeah, Kurion is a really interesting site because we know that sometime in the late 4th century, Kurion was hit pretty hard with earthquake damage, perhaps some tsunami. I mean, that's debated, but Kurion experienced a really traumatic, pardon the pun, earth-shaking event. In the aftermath of that, the people who lived there rebuilt. And in their rebuilding efforts, one of the key structures that we could talk about later is the Episcopal Basilica there. But another set or building project is this House of Eustolios that you mentioned. And what's really interesting is it's a complex that includes bath complex. And so it's not exactly clear, but we think it's some kind of public or semi-public bathing structure. And within that bathing structure, there are a number of really interesting mosaics. Some of the mosaics have imagery, and including an image of a personified Catesis, sort of creation goddess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there are also a number of mosaic inscriptions, right? And those mosaic inscriptions are really interesting because they acknowledge and they recognize the Greco-Roman past. And in fact, they said at one point, I'm paraphrasing, but at one point, Kurion and was sort of blessed by the god Apollo, right? Because close to Kurion is a very important sanctuary dedicated to Apollo. But that same inscription then says now the House of Eustolios, or this structure, is adorned with the symbols and images of Christ, right? So there's this kind of transition between the old polytheistic past to now this Christian world. But the inscription doesn't frame it in terms of like a hostile relationship, that it's pagans versus Christians, right? Or old ways versus new ways. But it almost speaks to what some might describe like as a smooth transition, right? So this House of Eustolios represents a really interesting moment in the history of Cyprus, but also of late antiquity, because It demonstrates for us this complicated relationship between pagan polytheism and Christianity. And so it's not so black and white as older narratives might say, but maybe a little bit grayer in terms of what we think of as a transition. Yeah.
How intertwined is Cyprus in early Christianity? I mean, for example, it's mentioned in the New Testament in the Acts of the Apostles. Does this early reference shape its Christian identity? I mean, what's starting to happen at this time?
This is a complicated question, and
Oh yeah, I know. I apologize.
No, it's a really good one too, because the answer, in some ways, might depend on whom you're talking to, right? So if you're talking to, let's say, a priest or a monk from Cyprus, the story and the narrative that they might provide could be very different than, let's say, what a historian would say. So let me kind of lay it out for you. You're absolutely right. The New Testament speaks about Cyprus in some cases in quite some detail, right? In the Acts narrative, Paul, the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, they travel through Cyprus, from Salamis eventually to Paphos, where, according to Acts, Paul is involved in the miraculous kind of conversion of the Roman proconsul Sergius Paulus is his name. And so there is this very early relationship between what we might call the Jesus movement or early Christianity, and Cyprus as a place where it takes root very early on, according to this tradition. And then your priest or your monk then would argue that Christianity in Cyprus, once it's there, continues from that point forward, and thrives and survives, and eventually, we reach later centuries where you have this autocephalous independent Cypriot church. From a historical and an archaeological point of view, there's very little evidence for Christianity in Cyprus in the late first and early second century, when this Acts narrative, would have unfolded. And in fact, there's very little evidence, direct evidence of Christianity at all, for really the first 3 centuries in Cyprus. And it's really only in the 4th century where we get sources, and in some cases archaeological material, that speaks to and testifies to Christianity in Cyprus. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't Christians there in the earlier centuries. It just means that the kind of evidence that we might look for is either lost or just not there. And so you get these two very kind of contrasting pictures, right? Where the Acts narrative tells us that the Roman proconsul converted to Christianity, right? And that would be a really significant event, right? But then the material record doesn't quite line up with that storyline. That doesn't mean Christianity wasn't there, but it doesn't appear in either the written sources or archaeological material until much later.
Now, I might be putting you on the spot here, Young. Would you happen to know what is the earliest archaeology that attests to Christianity's presence in Cyprus, off the top of your head?
I mean, the question you asked is like a really important one, right? Because what lies behind it is, what are the material objects that are uniquely or distinctively Christian, right? And because we could say that in the earlier centuries that I mentioned, where we don't have material, there may be objects or things that we could say we might associate with Christianity, but they could equally be used or representative of other religious traditions or cultures, right? So I think, in my understanding, especially when we talk about churches, The earliest material archaeological evidence that we have for churches in Cyprus comes from the 4th century, the late 4th century, in fact. And so that would be an example. Here is undoubtedly Christian architecture that speaks to this. Earlier than that, we actually don't have church structures, right? But even smaller objects, the things that you would expect in a church, like liturgical features that are objects that are used in liturgy, or decorations that have Christian themes and motifs on them. We don't really have anything before the 4th century. So again, I think that, as I was saying earlier, that narrative about the 4th century being the beginning of the Christian centuries in Cyprus, I think that's proven by the material record.
Yeah. And I feel like I've read somewhere that it's like finding that those archaeological traces is all the more difficult given that early Christianity was practiced in the home, where you're not really, you might find someone's house, but who's to say that that may have been a place of worship at the same time, which makes it all that more difficult to distinguish between a residence and a place where people may have gathered and perform some sort of liturgical act as a community. If that makes any sense, what I'm saying.
It absolutely does, right? And so you're right. There are ways of practicing a religion, or in this case, Christianity, that don't end up appearing in the material or archaeological record because they took place in like someone's home, right? As an example. So you're exactly right. That and I've been trying to hint at this, right? It doesn't mean Christians weren't there. It just means they didn't. It's harder to find things that they would have left behind that are undeniably Christian.
Right. In this early period, the tenets they're not fleshed out yet in early Christianity, which requires a series of councils. These councils are there to kind of drive out heretical thought, and kind of clear out what is orthodoxy in the lowercase o and what isn't. It's really cool to see that Cyprus is present in many of these councils, including the first, the Council of Nicaea, which include the signatories of Cyril of Paphos and Gelasios of Salamis. And can you just tell us first about what is Cyprus's role at these councils, and does it hint at a little bit about Cyprus's importance in the growing Christian world?
Yeah, great observation. So, how I was mentioning earlier in terms of our literary sources, Cyprus really Christian Cyprus comes onto the scene in the 4th century, right? I should mention this too earlier, that I should mention this. There are what we call hagiographies, or saints' lives, that are written in Cyprus beginning sort of in the 5th, but really flourishing in the 5th, 6th, and then early 7th centuries. Those hagiographies situate their saints in earlier times, including in the times where I said there is no evidence, right? But those are later sources looking back and putting their saintly figures in a time period where I was suggesting that we don't have other sources, material or literary, to support that, the things that they were doing. But with councils, the Cypriot church or churches come to the source record, specifically, as you say, at the Council of Nicaea, right? The first, what Christians generally regard as the first ecumenical council. And this is really interesting because, number one, you have at least 2 representatives there, right, from the 2 major port cities of Paphos and Salamis. There is a tradition that puts a 3rd Cypriot there, Spiridon, Saint Spiridon of Trimithus, which is an inland city. But their participation at this council means that, number one, there is some kind of established hierarchical church with bishops, okay, which then actually hints and suggests to us that those structures must have been around certainly before 325 when that council happened, right? So you could say that Cypriot Christianity had structures in place much earlier, right? Because you have these bishops who are there, and someone had to choose those bishops, and someone had to believe those bishops had authority. But their presence at Nicaea is very important because the Cypriot church tradition argues that Cyprus always is committed to orthodoxy, or what we would call the right beliefs about and practices of Christianity. And so the Council of Nicaea was a debate about the nature of the relationship, for the nature of the relationship between God the Father and then his son, Jesus Christ, right? And the council, the council doesn't solve the theological debate. It actually opens a can of worms, and the debate actually rages on for decades after. But it was the beginning point of a process in which Christians more clearly define and debate and discuss that relationship of father and son, right? And the Orthodox position, or what we consider the Orthodox position, eventually concludes that the father and son are what we might call correlative, that they're part of a divine Godhead or divine God that is of a singular, this is the formula, right? Singular substance, but three distinct persons, right? And the debate about the Holy Spirit comes into it comes a bit later. But the Cypriots at Nicaea and then subsequent councils will always consistently side on the side that eventually becomes the Orthodox position. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. So in other words, the Cypriot representation always supports, always ends up being the Orthodox one. And when I say Orthodox, I don't mean the modern Orthodox Church. I mean lowercase Orthodox, in exactly. That it's the one that survives in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, filioque aside, yeah. But that's the one that survives. Yeah, no, that does make sense. Another interesting and significant issue in the period, which I think we kind of hinted at in the importance of Christianity from the perspective of a church father in laying out Christianity in Cyprus and its role in Saint Barnabas being its patron saint and so on and so forth, is its autocephalic status.
Yes,
and that's very important to this period. It's also very important to the Church of Cyprus. And autocephalic is not a word that people use in their everyday, conversation. So do you mind telling us first what ecclesiastical autocephaly is?
Yeah.
And why it's significant and specific, particularly for Cyprus?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a fun topic to talk about. So autocephaly is the idea that a church is independent, that it has the rights and the authority to choose its own leaders. And we're talking about the archbishop or the head bishop and its church bishops. And so as Christianity develops in the early centuries, and especially from the 4th century moving forward, the structures and the organization and the hierarchy become increasingly organized, right? And there are different centers of power and authority. And these often line up with some of the most important and prosperous and powerful cities in the Roman Mediterranean world. So the bishop or the archbishop of Alexandria, for example, has a strong claim to authority over all of the bishops of Egypt and Libya and other parts of North Africa. The same could be said of the Bishop of Rome, right? And the Bishop of Rome will eventually become the Pope, right, as we understand him to be today, right? And so then the Bishop of Rome could claim to have authority to select bishops and choose leaders and move people around as he saw fit for the western part of the Roman Empire. But other cities like Antioch could also make similar claims to that kind of authority. Now, what's really important too is that each of these major cities and their archbishops could appeal to very old traditions, apostolic traditions that said XYZ apostle founded our church, and therefore the authority of that apostle is passed down. So the Bishop of Rome could claim, as the Bishop of Rome does, that both Peter, St. Peter, and St. Paul, Peter as kind of the founder of the church and the one who received the keys of the kingdom from Jesus, and then Paul as the most important missionary saint, because both of them, Peter establishing the church in Rome according to tradition, but also both of them dying there, being martyred there, that gives the Bishop of Rome the power that Jesus had given to Peter, right? So then each of the major cities, Alexandria could claim Saint Mark, right? Antioch also could claim Peter. And so apostolic authority was one of the bases then for ecclesiastical independence, right? So the Bishop of Rome couldn't tell the Bishop of Alexandria what to do or who to ordain or, where to build a church. So Cyprus, how does Cyprus fit into this? Well, beginning again in the 5th century, the city of Antioch tried to assert its authority over Cyprus and the church there. But the Cypriots themselves really resisted that. And they resisted that by making a series of different arguments at different church councils that Cyprus has and always has been an independent church without the oversight of the archbishop of another city, in this case, the city of Antioch. But that debate, even though church councils recognize Cypriot independence, that debate, if we want to call it that, doesn't actually get fully resolved until the end of the 5th century, when the Cypriots, by a miracle, the Archbishop of Cyprus discovers, or has revealed to him, the location of the body of Saint Barnabas, the figure from the New Testament, and the discovery of the body of Barnabas, and then the body is actually holding on to a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, written by Barnabas, copied by him. And so then the Emperor Zeno says, okay, clearly Cyprus is an apostolic church, and so therefore it has and will be autocephalous, right, or independent. And so the discovery of Barnabas and his body, his martyred body, that becomes the clearest argument for Cyprus to say we've always been an independent church because we are an apostolic church, right? And so that, however, doesn't happen until the late 5th century, right? So it's this interesting question then, where was, or why do people not talk about Barnabas, Christians on Cyprus talk about Barnabas before that, but only at this moment? And that's, a matter of debate about how you interpret that. But
sorry, it's also works out a little nicely for the Church of Cyprus as well, given that I think the Church of Antioch does become, I don't know if this is the right phrase to describe them, but they become schismatic at some point, where they are in communion with the other ecumenical churches, and that kind of allows Cyprus to kind of press its claim at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, so in the 4th century, when Christians are debating the Trinity, the bishops of Antioch often were represented by bishops who, from a later point of view, would be considered heretics, right? So they would be ones who denied the correlative divinity between Father and Son. And then there were other times where in Antioch you have situations where you have multiple claimants to be the archbishop. So you have different like schismatic factions. And in fact, the Cypriots at the Council of Ephesus, they mention this, right? They're like, Antioch is they paraphrase, but Antioch's a hot mess of theology and ecclesiastical division, right? And so why would the Church of Cyprus have been under the authority of anyone from Antioch? And the Antiochenes actually also recognize that. They basically say, yeah, the 4th century was not good, but now we're in right order, right? And so that's in fact why Antioch was claiming now we're reclaiming our rightful authority over Cyprus, right? And so that argument, again, is really interesting because it's a kind of theological and ecclesiological argument for why Antioch should be have authority over Cyprus, but then Cyprus resisted that. And in fact, they made the argument, hey, we've always been Orthodox. Look especially at Saint Epiphanius, who is like the paragon of Orthodoxy.
Yeah. Which we will 100% talk about him. Huge part of this episode. Okay, so I got one more question for you, and this is a big one. All right, so I apologize for this one. So we're sort of coming full circle here because we talked about the archaeological record, epistolary records, and you mentioned that a lot of what we know for the late antiquity and early Christianity in Cyprus, we rely on hagiography, and it's often dismissed as fiction, right? But you make the point that it can provide us some really crucial historical insight.
Yes.
And that it can help us understand the world in late antiquity. Now, for example, you actually describe Cyprus as a hub of Mediterranean connectivity. And I kind of want to better understand, how do these hagiographies that you talk about give us insight into this period and reflect this interconnected world, and where and how do they kind of match the archaeological and historical record? Do hagiographies give us more information on Cyprus's role in the late antique world, religiously and economically and whatever else?
Yeah, so you've touched on like a debate that has gone on for a very, very long time, right? And there was a time in kind of the work of historians when hagiographies were, as you say, largely dismissed as just pure fiction, right? And don't get me wrong, there are fictive elements within hagiographies. And again, it also depends on your point of view and your perspective and perhaps your personal beliefs. But, there are stories of miraculous things that happen. And depending on your point of view, you may believe they actually happened, or you may dismiss them as things that were made up by the writers. And so hagiography and how we can potentially use it as a historical source, that's been debated for a very, very long time. I fall on the side of yes, they are narrative constructs, right? They're written by the hagiographers, but I hold that within those narrative structures, there are certainly aspects of the historical world in which these authors wrote that we can extrapolate from these saints' lives. And so one of the arguments I try to make is that hagiographies tell us about not necessarily the world of the saint, right? Because as is often the case, and is especially true of Cypriot hagiography, the writers of those saints' lives, their figures are like 300 years removed from the time that they're actually writing, right? So a good example of this might be the tradition about Saint Barnabas, right? There are a number of different writings about Barnabas, who in principle is a 1st century figure, but these writings were written much later, right, in the 5th and then in the 6th centuries. But what I am arguing is that the writers of those saints' lives, they operate in a world that is familiar to them. And there are features of that world, including travel and the movement of people, economic activities, political events, natural events. I believe that there are features of those saints' lives that we can say, okay, this at least for the writer of the hagiography, but then also for the readers or the listeners, that would have made sense to them, right? They would have understood when the saint's life, let's say, talks about a saint going on a ship and traveling from Cyprus to the Levantine coast, or vice versa. Like, those kinds of things were realistic to them, and so it would have made sense, because these saints' lives, even though they have these miraculous and sometimes unbelievable stories, they are often and usually situated in a world that makes sense to the writers and to the listeners. And so I think that's where we can make some and use these saints' lives as historical sources. We have to be very careful, of course, and there's no guarantee, but that's why archaeology is so important, because archaeology can support some of the conclusions that we draw from hagiography.
Let's talk about Ios Epiphanios, or Saint Epiphanius, who is a very interesting saint, interesting person, often characterized as a compulsive heresy hunter, who sometimes has been called theologically inept and narrow-minded and fanatical. How has modern scholarship traditionally viewed Epiphanius, and why do you think he's been marginalized in discussion of late antiquity? Is a legacy that has been struggled with? What's your take on him?
Yeah, great question. Epiphanius is famous for writing this massive work called the Panarion, which you can translate as medicine chest. It actually also could mean like a breadbasket. But the Panarion was this encyclopedic manual. In the modern edition of the Greek text, it's like 1,200 pages. It's massive, okay? But this encyclopedic manual includes descriptions of the beliefs and practices, but also refutations of 80 different heresies that Epiphanius identified as being against Christianity. One of the things that Epiphanius did, though, with the Panarion was he often included huge chunks of text written by other Christian authors that he admired. So there's a famous earlier 2nd century writer named Irenaeus, and Epiphanius includes a huge chunk of the text of Irenaeus. He also includes writings by another figure named Methodius. But at the same time, Epiphanius also included, at times, the writings of the people that he condemned as heretics. And so one of the ways that scholars in the past approached the Panarion was they were more interested in mining it for the texts of other writers more than they were interested in the thought and ideas of Epiphanius himself. And one of the reasons why is that when you actually get into some of these texts, Epiphanius has a tendency to be very long-winded at times. And other times he's very, very polemical. He's attacking people. He's insulting them. He's using ideas and concepts that are really kind of hyperbolic and exaggerated. And so for a long time, scholars thought Epiphanius was like you said, kind of a fanatic, or different words to use him, he might be a fundamentalist or narrow-minded, especially because he was very, very, at least in writing, opposed to what he called what we call paideia or paideia, right? Greek culture, right? He was very opposed to it. He thought Greek culture, especially Greek philosophy, when you he thought that if you intermingle Greek philosophy with Christian theology, that leads to heresy, right? So for Epiphanius, the great heretic in his mind was this very important Christian thinker named Origen. And so because Epiphanius has this kind of personality and character and seeming narrow-mindedness, scholars were less inclined to study him in his own right. And that's where I tried to do something a little bit different with my doctoral work, but then also my early publications, was to think about and to kind of treat Epiphanius on his own terms. And other scholars have actually done a lot of work as well, including a very good friend of mine, Andrew Jacobs, wrote this really important book about Epiphanius that is trying to situate him in his 4th century late antique world, right? And so he is an important contributor and a figure in this history of this period from the point of view of, let's say, a very zealous and very, you could say conservative Christian, right? But I think that perspective is as important as some of the other ones. And that's what I try to do with Epiphanius, is kind of revive or revise how we regard him, not just as like a fringe figure, but actually as someone who's very representative of some of the trends and the developments that are taking place in late antiquity.
When I was preparing for this, you brought up this point of seeing these beautiful frescoes that depict early church fathers. You see Epiphanius beside archbishops of Alexandria and Constantinople, the Saint John Chrysostom. But you say that, like, what we don't realize when looking at these frescoes is that there is this historical conflict that just, lay people like myself would not have known.
Yeah.
That at the time they would have disliked each other, or what other ways we can describe it. But yeah. I mean, I'm just curious. Let's just to kind of unpack that a little bit about how these church fathers butt heads in this early period.
Oh, yeah. So remember, I was mentioning earlier the kind of archbishops of the major cities and their authority, and in some cases, some of the competition that was happening between the archbishops of these cities. And one of the major tension points in the 4th and into the 5th centuries is the relationship between the city of Alexandria and the city of Constantinople. Right. And as you know from your history, Constantinople was kind of made, right, a new city that was established by the Emperor Constantine, built on the foundations of an earlier Greek city, Byzantium. But Constantinople became the imperial capital, right? It was the second Rome. But at the same time, Constantinople didn't have any kind of church history that it could claim, or that its bishop could claim as part of its the basis of its authority. And so, but nevertheless, because it was the imperial capital and often the place where emperors resided, the bishop or the archbishop of Constantinople was a very important figure. And so what we find especially at the end of the 4th century, is that there is a serious tension between Alexandria and Constantinople, and we might throw Antioch in there as well, right? And one of these moments where the tensions boil over happens to be at the end of Epiphanius's life. At the time, the Archbishop of Alexandria was this figure named Theophilus, and Theophilus was, he was a very political figure, right? And tried to involve himself in the affairs of other churches and other communities beyond Egypt. And he clashed with Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, who had become the archbishop or the bishop of Constantinople. And in his kind of clash with Chrysostom, one of the things that Theophilus did was he persuaded Epiphanius. He persuaded him that, number one, that Chrysostom was a heretic, an Origenist heretic. And number two, he persuaded Epiphanius to actually travel to Constantinople to confront Chrysostom on his heresy. And so we have these letters that tell us about this. And the story is much more complicated, and I'm kind of simplifying it. But Epiphanius eventually does travel to Constantinople, where he clashes with Chrysostom. Chrysostom, from the sources, he was generally like respectful and trying to accommodate Epiphanius, but Epiphanius kept on doing things to provoke Chrysostom, including going to Constantinople and then ordaining someone there to the clergy, which would not have been in his authority because he didn't have any kind of power to do that in the capital, but he did.
Yeah.
And eventually, though, it seems Epiphanius realizes that he was kind of a pawn in these schemes that Theophilus was laying out. And so he actually leaves Constantinople kind of despondent, knowing that he had been kind of played the fool. But in some of the sources, before he leaves, he basically says he and Chrysostom basically insult each other, or you might even say curse each other, right? Epiphanius basically says, "I hope you don't. I hope you." He basically said, "I hope you die no longer a bishop." Right? He says,
Wow.
by the time you die, I hope you're not a bishop. And then Chrysostom basically says to Epiphanius, "I hope you don't make it home alive." And yeah, and interestingly enough, Epiphanius does die at sea in 403 in May on his way home. And so this moment of like mutual cursing is a really delicate moment, right? Because you have two saintly figures regarded by the Orthodox Church as fathers of the church, basically condemning each other, right? And so what happens then is that in the hagiographic tradition, there's a kind of rehabilitation process where that relationship or the tensions in that relationship are kind of smoothed over, and that the motivations that Epiphanius had for going to Constantinople, the people that he was clashing with, the hagiographical tradition kind of shifts them to different figures so that this kind of mutual animosity between Chrysostom and Epiphanius is kind of brushed under the rug, and then so that we can eventually have these two church fathers standing side by side in church fresco decoration without any problems at all, right? So it's just really interesting. I wrote an article about this like rehabilitation process.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as someone who would identify as being Christian Orthodox, you see these wonderful works of art in an Orthodox church, and you rarely do you step back and consider that the historicity of what goes behind these representations, and to know that Saint Epiphanius, who is a very important, church father and someone who is of who you would identify with Cyprus. I mean, we would consider him a firebrand, right?
Yes, for sure.
Do we know anything about Epiphanius and how he ascended to this position? Because he's not actually from Cyprus. He emigrates to Cyprus as an adult, I believe. I mean, yeah. What do we know? Yeah, how does he get there in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, he's from Palestine, and we're not exactly sure about the date of his birth, but we kind of put it roughly at 315 or so. And then the hagiography, this is where, again, your question earlier, right, where the hagiography and what we know historically might not align. The hagiography says that Epiphanius was actually born into a Jewish family and that he eventually converts to Christianity. Whereas, like, the historical sources, especially the writings of these 5th century church historians, there's no real trace of that Jewish background. But whatever the case may be, Epiphanius is from Palestine. He lives for a time in Egypt, where he trains to be a monk. And then he returns home, and he actually establishes a monastery, and he's the abbot of this monastery. But eventually, at some point, and I think this is in the late 360s, he ends up traveling to Cyprus to visit his mentor. His mentor was another famous church monk by the name of Hilarion. And Hilarion had fled to Cyprus because he was so sick and tired of like crowds seeking him out and bothering him while he was trying to live his monastic lifestyle. But Epiphanius visited Hilarion, it seems, in Cyprus, And again, this is where you get a little bit tricky because I'm looking at the hagiography as well. But eventually, Epiphanius ends up in the city of Salamis, where he is identified by another Cypriot church figure there. And eventually he is ordained and then chosen to be the Archbishop of the island in 367. So for at least like 50 years or so of his life, Epiphanius was living his life in Palestine, but then he becomes, he immigrates, as you say, to Cyprus, and then from 367 until his death in 403, and that means he lived quite a long time, especially by ancient standards. He is the Bishop of Cyprus and is involved in all of these heresy hunting kind of activities and writings. And so he becomes kind of synonymous with Cyprus, not in the 4th century, but again in the 5th century, especially in that debate about autocephaly. The Cypriots themselves, they claim Epiphanius as their church father, right? The always Orthodox church father. And so he really rises to that kind of level of prominence in the 5th century. And so in some of the churches where we have these frescoes, these medieval frescoes, Epiphanius is often depicted together with Barnabas. So Barnabas and Epiphanius are sort of regarded as founders of the Cypriot autocephalous church.
He strikes me as someone who's parallel or akin to Saint Cyril of Alexandria.
Yes.
The one who, I don't know if we say responsible for the murder of Hypatia, but would they have known each other? Do they overlap in this period in any way?
Right. So Theophilus, remember that bishop that I mentioned earlier, right, of Alexandria?
Yeah.
He is, I can't remember I think he's Cyril's uncle. I can't remember the exact relationship, but okay. So Theophilus and Cyril are very similar, very, very political, very, very zealous Christians. And Epiphanius and Theophilus are very, very similar also. And so Epiphanius didn't know Cyril, they didn't overlap, but I think, as you're kind of suggesting, they're cut from the same mold, right? Okay. In terms of like how zealous they are about their beliefs, but also how political they can be, right? And that's the thing, right? You mentioned earlier, like these church fathers, sometimes we forget that they were humans and they were very political and sometimes very ambitious. And Cyril, if you want to talk about ambitious bishops, he is one of the most ambitious and powerful bishops in all of the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
I know people are sensitive about thinking of church fathers as political, but they were, right?
Yeah. No, and fair enough. You got to humor me here. There is a in Saint Epiphanius's one of his hagiographies. There's a tale of an exorcism that he performs.
Yeah, so exorcising of demons is a common trope in pretty much any hagiography you read. And so for not only Epiphanius, but the other saints of Cyprus, especially the 1st century ones like Heraclidios and Auxivios, all of these saints have these clashes with demon-possessed individuals. And then they free those possessed individuals from the evil spirits. And this trope is important, right? Because it, number one, echoes the Gospels, right? When Jesus clashes with demon-possessed individuals, in some cases speaks to the demons. But number two, the demons often acknowledge and recognize the holy figure. And that's a kind of roundabout way of showing that particular figure is definitely one of, on God's side, right? And so when demons confront Jesus and they say they know who he is, that's a signal for the reader to understand, okay, Jesus is definitely sent by God. And then with the Cypriot figures, when these kind of clashes happen too, again, it's like a way of acknowledging the holiness of that particular figure, right? And Epiphanios, he exorcises demons, he raises people from the dead, he clashes with secular and pagan figures. I mean, there are so many different examples from the hagiography of these kinds of clashes. And it's really interesting because one of the demon figures that he exorcises basically curses him and says, I'm going to go to the king of Persia and I'm going to make the Persians cause you trouble, right? And so Epiphanios eventually makes his way to the Persian Empire, where he miraculously heals the daughter of the Persian king, because this demon riled up the Persian king against Epiphanios. But the Persian king is so impressed by Epiphanios, he says, "Hey, I want you to stay at my court and to be one of my advisors." And Epiphanius says, "No, thanks," and he makes his way back home. But that's just a funny story of how this demon who was exorcised stirs up more trouble. But these stories become opportunities for saints like Epiphanios to do even more saintly things.
Listeners might know that Cyprus has been called the island of saints. I think there's maybe over 200 local saints in Cyprus, and please correct me if I'm wrong on that. But most of these saints, they're not saints in the traditional sense of being martyrs. Is there any particular reason for that? Did you ever come across this kind of observation?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. There's a lot of important scholarly work about Cypriot hagiography. One of the most important scholars is based in Cyprus. His name is Stefanos Efthymiadis, and he wrote this recent book that really explores the entire tradition. Another scholar, Diego Arfuch, wrote again another study of Cyprus. And one of the challenges that scholars have had is how to categorize the different kinds of hagiographies in the Cypriot tradition. So, and we kind of divide them into two halves. One of them are the kind of hagiographies that deal with the first century saints. So these are like Barnabas, Iraklidios, Auxibios. These are figures who do end up becoming martyred in most cases. And so then, that martyrdom is an important part of those stories. But the thing we have to remember about those hagiographies, they were all written 300-400 years after the very lives of these particular saints. Whereas the other category of Cypriot saints, and the one that's actually more prominent, which includes someone like Epiphanios, is that Cypriot saints are they're bishops, right? So they're figures of leadership in the Cypriot church who become these saintly figures, and they perform all sorts of miracles as these bishops. But the martyrdom is not a part of their storylines, right? Because they are bishops and they're living and they're doing their thing in the time when Christianity is legal in the Roman Empire, and in some cases becoming the most powerful belief system in the empire. And so the bishop saint is the tradition that really takes prominence in Cypriot hagiography. And that's why there's less emphasis on the kind of martyrdom saint, which is often true of especially of some of the earlier hagiographies from other parts of the empire. And in Cyprus, it's all about the church, right? Which I think is a distinct Cypriot flavor, right? And it's tied to their claims to autocephaly too. But the church is so important to the institutional and structural church is so important to Cyprus. Yeah.
All right. So in the 7th century, we see some major upheavals, including some invasions. And I believe there is one source, Leontios of Neapolis, Life of John the Almsgiver, whose work captures this period of transition. Can you tell me a little bit about what is this period of transition right now, and what's happening?
Right. Okay. So the 7th century, right? I mentioned this earlier, is perhaps the key moment of transition for Cyprus from its late antique or ancient period to the medieval, right? And very specifically, it's the middle of the 7th century in 648, 649. So the source you just mentioned, the life of Saint John the Almsgiver by Leondios of Neapolis, John was he was the Archbishop of Alexandria, actually, but he's originally from Cyprus. He's from Amathus. John eventually flees Alexandria and makes his way back to Cyprus, but he flees he's fleeing the Persians, because in the kind of the first quarter of the 7th century, the Persian Empire is involved in a number of different aggressive moves into the Roman Empire. And eventually, the Persians are successful in taking Syria, Palestine, and they actually do conquer Egypt for a time, right? And then the Emperor Heraclius is involved in the reconquest of these lost territories, and it's in that time when John flees to Cyprus. But that's in some ways kind of the prelude to the other major event, right? And the other major development in this early 7th century is the birth and the rise and the spread of Islam, right? And the Islamic, these are Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula. They began a series of conquests in which they will topple the Persian Empire. And then they, again, they take over all of Mesopotamia, they take over Syria, they take over Palestine, and they took over Egypt. And it seems at a certain point, they start to have ambitions to go on into the sea. And so we know that in this mid-7th century, Arab Muslims invade Cyprus for the first time. And again, the sources are varied, but they cause some serious destruction and disruption and displacement of peoples, right? So in traditional kind of narratives of the history of Cyprus, that first invasion, and then there's a subsequent invasion. It's debated when it happens, perhaps the next year or perhaps about 4 or 5 years later. But these invasions or incursions, they change the fate of Cyprus from that point forward. Now, this is very important to understand. The Arabs don't conquer all of Cyprus and rule it, okay? There are some people who kind of hold that idea, but they don't do that. But they do establish some kind of long-term presence in Cyprus. We're pretty sure that it's in and around the area of Paphos in the southwest. And then, the history gets complicated, but eventually the Byzantine or the Roman Empire and the Islamic Caliphate, they make a treaty that establishes Cyprus as a kind of neutral zone that has to pay double taxes, both to the Byzantine Roman Empire and then to the Islamic Caliphate.
And so now Cyprus shifts ultimately from being a center of connectivity to a place of refuge, which kind of brings us full circle here, Young. This was awesome. I loved having this chat about Cyprus in late antiquity.